Welcome to episode 458 of the Thunder Underground podcast. Trent here as usual. And this week is going to be a great one because it is May 7th, 2026, which, as you could probably tell there in that title or the cover image of this podcast, that means it's been 30 years since the release of Pantera's album, The Great Southern Trendkill. Came out on this date 30 years ago, so I'm going to talk a bit about it. And in the process of thinking, hey, this is one of those albums I'd like to talk about in detail a little more than a blurb, I thought I need to get a hold of Jason, who used to do the podcast with me, because I know he is as big a Pantera fan as I am. And especially, during the 90s, during when Pantera was in their prime, basically when Pantera was a fully functioning band. I guess they are now, but you know what I mean. In their original run, we were there for the majority of it and, got to see them live several times during that period. And since throughout the history of this podcast, we're at 11 years now, we've had a lot of Pantera talk and Pantera-centric episodes throughout the years. Never technically had on a member of Pantera as a guest, even though Phil and Selma was on this podcast one time. That's something, me and Jason would bring up every once in a while back when he was still doing the podcast with me, and I've mentioned it a few times since, but, I'll tell that story related to Phil being on the podcast right when the interview ends. But he was on this podcast for a good 30, 45 seconds once a few years ago. I'll let you know how that came to be, but before we get into this talk about the Great Southern Trendkill, I need to let you know who sponsors this podcast. Sunset Tattoo is a tattoo shop located in Midtown Tulsa. Their tattoos are done good and proper. They're state licensed, Native American owned, and they have a female artist on staff full time. They accept walk-ins. You can also set up a time to go in there and talk about what work you're looking to have done. They've got tons of photos on their social medias you can check out to see that they specialize in all different kinds of styles. Sunset Tattoo Tulsa on both Instagram and Facebook. I've had multiple tattoos done by Jake at Sunset Tattoo that I'm very happy with. I know many others that have as well. And in fact, there's probably been some members of a band you love that have as well. Jake has tattooed many members of some well-known rock, hard rock, heavy metal bands throughout the years as well. His shop is dedicated in celebrating the world of hard rock and heavy metal, kind of like we do here at Thunder Underground. So it's a good partnership. Very happy to have Sunset Tattoo going strong after all these years. Appreciate their support. Get in there and tell them you heard about them right here on Thunder Underground. We've also got DEB Concerts, our longest running sponsor, concert promoter based in the Tulsa area that has brought tons of great acts to the downtown area of Tulsa, such as Megadeth, Lamb of God, Saxon, Last in Line, Buck Cherry, Snoop Dogg, Ice Cube, Great White, LA Guns, Steelheart. The list is massive and long, and it's ever growing. DEB Concerts books the Roadhouse DEB concert stage at Rocklahoma every year. That also includes the pre-party, which is included with your 3-day ticket. This year at Rocklahoma, you can check out rocklahoma.com for the full lineup, which features headliners like Slayer, Godsmack, and Papa Roach. But the DEB concert stage specifically will feature Plush, She Hates Me Not, a Van Halen tribute called Jump, 7 Foot Monkey, an Ozzy tribute called Ozolution, Molly Hatchet, Slaughter. Hey, Mark Slaughter has been on this podcast twice, and the almighty Ugly Kid Joe. One of my favorite vocalists of all time, Whitfield Crane, one of the most underrated bands ever, for their first time at Rocklahoma here on the 20th anniversary. Super excited to be able to see Ugly Kid Joe once again. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. DEB Concerts. Hit him up at debconcerts.com to be kept up to date. And of course, we keep you up to date right here. And speaking of Rocklahoma, the Rocklahoma Bitches are back as a sponsor leading up to Rocklahoma 2026 once again. They've been an institution at Rocklahoma dating back to 2011, 15 plus years now. Almost the full 20 years. I've personally been fortunate enough to make it to every Rocklahoma since 2007. I'll be out there once again this year in 2026 along with the Rocklahoma Bitches. Christy and Kendra are very supportive of the community of Rocklahoma. That's what they're out there. They're always out there hosting events at the parties that go on in the campgrounds. They've got tons of merch for Rocklahoma Bitches, t-shirts, koozies, bags, stickers. They have new stuff every single time I see them, and they will give you all this stuff at Rocklahoma for absolutely free. They don't charge for a single piece of their merch. They're always flying around to campgrounds, passing out this stuff to support Rocklahoma and support their love of the festival-going experience. They're very charitable besides just their merch. Christy always bids on the autographed guitars that Rocklahoma auctions off every year for charity, and she usually walks away with one. Rocklahoma Bitches also sponsors the Cancer Sucks benefit that happens in Tulsa every year at the end of November to, of course, raise money for cancer that happens at the Canes Ballroom. Rocklahoma Bitches, super excited to have them back, partnered with Thunder Underground, leading up to Rocklahoma once again. All right, there's not a lot that needs to be said, leading up to this interview, because we're going to say it throughout the course of this interview. But Jason, my former co-host of this podcast, he stepped away from the podcast a few years ago, but he's came back throughout the years many times. As the most recent time was earlier this year, I believe it was January, maybe early February. I should have looked at the date, but when Megadeth put out their most recent album, their self-titled album that came out at the beginning of the year, me and Jason did an episode our thoughts, review of the quote-unquote final Megadeth studio album, as Dave Mustaine is saying. I tend to believe, that might be the case, but as far as touring, I think he'll do that until he physically cannot, which might be sooner than later, unfortunately, but I'm getting off on a wild tangent. So check out that episode that Jason came and joined me for just a couple months ago. But what we're talking about right now is the fact that the Great Southern Trendkill came out on May 7th, 2026, 30 years ago today. If you're listening to this the day it drops, if you're listening to this in the future, appreciate you checking it out. This was Pantera's 8th album overall, and it was their 4th major label album, 5th album with Phil. They had one album with Phil before they hit the major label scene with Cowboys from Hell. And this was kind of like the peak of their maybe not the peak of their popularity, but the peak of Pantera, because everything had been building up to this point. It was such a kind of a whirlwind thing where you got these albums that just kept progressing and kept making the band slightly bigger. And Vulgar, was the album that pushed them out of the underground, and then Far Beyond Driven was the album that pushed them from where they were into basically the mainstream stratosphere, because they were the first metal band to ever debut a number one album. This album came out just a couple years later and just kind of accentuated that by getting even heavier. And one thing I did want to point out that I don't mention in the talk with Jason coming up is that one of the times I saw Pantera live in the 90s was with, my and Jason's buddy Michael Thrasher. Me and him went down to Dallas, Texas, Pantera's hometown, and got to see them perform live on New Year's Eve, 1995, going into 1996. So this would have been, less than 5 months before this album dropped. They dropped, pun intended, I guess, dropped just a plethora of pieces of paper from the rafters that just basically had a picture of Pantera and said, look forward, Happy New Year, look forward to the heaviest album of 1996. And I can't talk on the fact of if it was the heaviest album. I'm sure it was not. I mean, if I said that right now or anybody else did, I'm sure there'd be a million other metal geeks that'll jump in the comments of a YouTube video and say, well, this Scandinavian, death metal band was heavier. And of course, there's tons of extreme metal bands and tons of heavier bands than Pantera, and even Pantera at their heaviest. But as far as what Pantera was doing, I guess with mainstream metal, there wasn't much heavier. Death metal had never really had a mainstream moment. But for the most part, bands like Pantera didn't really get mainstream moments either, outside of obviously Metallica, but then a band like, Megadeth and Anthrax and these bands who had slight mainstream success in the early 90s, kind of after Metallica blew up all over the place. You would get bands coming in and out that might have, a little bit of success on the radio, like Corrosion and Conformity, whoever. White Zombie, of course, is another band that got really big. But what Pantera was doing at an extreme level, when you talk about songs like The Great Southern Trendkill, Suicide Note Part 2, I mean, obviously these songs weren't getting blasted on rock radio, but you know what I mean. They, as far as a band that is in the mainstream, that has an album that is placing high, charting high, debuting high on the Billboard charts, it was not common. And it's still not common to this day. I mean, we're 30 years later. I know there's going to be bands, you know, I'm not thinking of. There's a handful of bands throughout the years like Slipknot, Lamb of God, System of a Down. Obviously, there's more of the radio hard, heavy bands like Disturbed or Godsmack that, you know, would have great Billboard success. But I mean, as far as like truly metal bands, your Slipknot, Lamb of God, System of a Down, and I'm sure a couple of these more recently, you know, have as well. I feel like there was something besides Megadeth. You know, Megadeth had their first, you know, #1 debut. Bands like that, and Metallica, of course, always have high Billboard charting. I just listed, 5, 6 bands. And I'm sure that, you know, even if there's 5 or 6 more, we're talking a handful, under 20 bands throughout the history that have high charting heavy metal albums, and it's just not common. Tool, of course, another one, but again, not as extreme as Pantera, Slipknot, or something. It's just a cool thing to talk about, a moment in time that, even though it's happened since, it's still not a commonality, of course, in the world. But again, we're going to talk way more about this than I am right now, so I'm going to shut up and I'm going to jump into this. Here is Jason and I talking about Pantera's album, The Great Southern Trendkill. All right, so talking about Pantera's The Great Southern Trendkill, man, this came out 30 years ago on May 7th, debuted at number 4, you know, and that was kind of coming right off the heels of, you know, Far Beyond Driven being the first metal album to debut at number 1. So it was cool to see that they were still, you know, that wasn't kind of like a, you know, a flash in the pan moment.
Right.
I mean, they weren't at the level of Metallica, but they were like, you know, a band that kind of became a mainstay, you know, metal band at that point, I think.
Well, and here's the thing I was going to mention is this could be up for debate or people argue it. I don't know. But for me, you got to think, you know, at this time, what was this? So what are we doing? 96, right?
Right.
You've got these bands that had like huge, you've got these metal bands that had huge shit going on in the early 90s. And it carried over in their tours and stuff. By the time, you know, through 94 to 96, when everything changed, you kind of thought, man, what are some of these bands going to do?
Yeah.
I'm just going to say it because it kind of made sense in a way, in a weird, indirect way. Def Leppard was another band, like, you know, in 91, 92, their shit comes out, it's going to be amazing. But in 95 or 96, well, what are you guys going to do? How's this going to play out?
Right.
So, and I don't care if you were Def Leppard or Pantera. I don't care if you were a hair band or a straight up heavy metal band. The alternative thing it became such a I don't even know the word, so I'll just say it became such a thing in the early and mid 90s.
Yeah, it dominated the airwaves, basically, yeah.
Yeah, it really did. And you didn't know what some of these bands were going to do. And so Pantera, even though this album is Pantera, like it totally fit in that mid 90s. They were abrasive where they needed to be. They were dissonant where they needed to be. Like it totally carried them through. And we know that the Abbott brothers leaned heavily on 80s shit like Priest and Van Halen. But I think they knew well enough, like we need to lean on the grittier and the dirtier side of this kind of stuff. I think that worked for them, and I think that helped them through this.
Because I've always felt, I know we've talked about this before too, but I always felt this album feels the most like Phil had more influence than anyone else. But
absolutely, and there you go. That's another, because if you look at the Phil aspect, and he is completely fucking 90s metal, 90s underground metal. So yeah, you're bringing up a great point right there.
I mean, like you said, you still hear the earlier influence in some of these songs. You can hear where Dime is kind of still Dime, but there are also times where, like you said, him and even like Vinny and Rex, like the style is more aggressive than the albums previous to it. And Far Beyond Driven was pretty aggressive itself, so that's that was kind of
Right.
cool.
Right. You can really tell, like, so the story, the classic story goes is, the early 2000s they started splintering, and I get that. And if you really listen to all their shit, you can hear it. You can fucking hear it happen right before your ears. But you can tell, like, this record, probably Diamond and Vinny were like, yeah, let's kind of let Phil do his thing on this one. I think they knew that the times were ripe for this. So it was and and that's just me as a listener. I could totally be wrong, but just from that standpoint right there, that's why I think this was a great record and a smart record for them to do in 1996.
The thing I always loved too was that every album leading up to this, even if you go back to the albums previous to Cowboys from Hell, it's like every single album kind of had this trajectory of getting to this point. And they
Right, it just gets
kept getting a
heavier and
little bit more
heavier,
extreme and a little
and,
bit
and yeah,
dirtier.
and a little bit more fucked up. Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, they were, one of those few bands that could do that where every album kind of had its own style, but still sounded completely like Pantera.
Absolutely. I agree. I agree.
For me personally, this album came out at like the perfect time too, with being 19 years old, the attitude of it. And this is still like heavy in the period of like my life whenever, all of us, when we're like late teens, early 20s, really into music, you become really attached to full albums as a whole, probably more so than
Right,
you do later in your life, even if you love an
right.
album. Even though I love that the albums before it better, I feel like this one I probably obsessed over the most as a fan when it came out.
I get that, and now that you're saying that, it kind of makes me think of something else. Where, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but coming from where we came from in the late '80s and early '90s, and then seeing all the alternative '90s stuff just kind of decimate everything we loved musically in the rock world, to have this album like come out, it gave us hope. It felt good,
Yeah.
like, oh, maybe it's not all Tripping Daisy and Green Day. Maybe we can still do this here.
Right. At that point in my life too, I mean, I was never into death metal or any kind of like extreme vocals. And Phil,
Right.
was borderline on some of these songs where he gets that, like you said, that real
Yes.
underground metal sound. And this was around the same time that Fear Factory's demanufacture and came out, and I was getting into Sepultura too. So I think this is like the time period where I kind of like shifted. And I'm like, okay, I'm cool with extreme metal vocals now. And I think this album was a part of that process for me as a
Well,
fan.
absolutely.
One other side note about when the album came out, I have a distinct memory of buying it when I was on my lunch break at Cost Plus Baby Furniture.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. Went and grabbed that thing and was able to listen to like maybe half of it after I bought it at Best Buy before I had to get back to work. So,
Hey, those are the days, man. We put together a lot of furniture.
yeah, a lot of baby beds.
We loaded a lot of pickup trucks.
Well, jumping into the songs that, the opening track, again, kind of like I said about the right time for me as a fan, but it was also like the perfect time for this just because the message that they're portraying, from this song, lyrically and musically is like, fuck you to the mainstream, basically.
Right.
Maybe that opening first, whatever, 10, 15 seconds might be like the heaviest thing Pantera had done to that point, I think, unless I'm forgetting something.
I agree. And you bring up a great point with these bands that came out that kind of overtook a lot of the bands that we loved. It wasn't their fault.
Right.
If you're in a band and that's what you do and that's what you come up with, that's great. It's the way that the media and the public perceives it. in the way that they automatically perceive what you love, you know? So automatically rock shit was not cool all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So to hear something like this was, you know, it's like I don't really want anything to happen to Courtney Love, but to hear a song and hear a record come out that says fuck you to all that shit was amazing.
Yeah.
And that's what this kind of stuff did, you know.
Yeah.
The Great Southern Trendkill, you know, Olive Drab, you know, fuck yeah, I'm in.
Yeah.
Like this is the song I've been waiting for since like early '94.
Kind of like I mentioned before with like our age too. It's like when you're 20, you know, and you hear something like that, it's just like you latch onto it because you're like, fuck yeah, these guys think the same way I do.
Right, right, and it's not a commentary to the bands and the artists. It's a commentary to the perception and the acceptance, what the fans, how fickle the fans are, is really what it is. I mean, totally. Because you and me, I mean, look at, and this is a perfect example. What I'm going to mention is the tour of Pantera, Skid Row, and Soundgarden.
Oh yeah,
that is, to me, the epitome, and that is exactly what everything that heavy and hard music should be. Like the coming together of all those styles, right?
right.
But we're in the minority of that. Most people would be like, no, you can't do that. That's bullshit. Whether you're a Soundgarden fan or a Skid Row fan or a Pantera fan, a lot of people wouldn't get that. And to me, that's a detriment.
Yeah. But no, I mean, I thought that track was kind of like a perfect summation of like all the parts that make Pantera like a great Pantera song, because you had the extremeness of Phil, you have that killer riff from Dimebag. It was just kind of like, I mean, there's a few other songs like that on this album, but it just really kind of encapsulated both sides of the coin for me, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's just a killer opening track.
And then that goes into, you know, War Nerve, which is a little more, you know, the classic Pantera song from the last couple albums with the riffing and the rhythm section style. But it, you know, it's got that awesome kind of, you know, typical Phil fuck the world lyrics, groove metal on display like we expect from Pantera.
I love the spoken word part of that. And it's just more the, like we said, like really, like this is just such a Phil record. And it had him all over it. And it was just a violent thing. I really dug this song.
Yeah, same. I mean, the first single off the album was the third track, Drag the Waters, and this one's probably the most, of any of the songs, it's probably the most song that could have fit like on Far Beyond Driven or something.
Right, like right.
You know, it's got that.
Yeah, it was definitely, you could hear it on the radio, like at least at night or whatever.
I mean,
how they liked to do it back then.
I mean, but it still balanced that line where it was still aggressive, but it was like in the same way that like I'm Broken is or something like that, where it would have fit like on the radio, like you said.
Right.
What do we got after that? Tens. The heavy parts of Tens always reminded me of Down. And just, I don't know if it's just kind of like the down tune guitar maybe. And, you know, I love Dimebag's solo on this. And it's kind of that, it's very reminiscent of like Cowboys almost. Yeah. It's kind of like, it kind of stands on its own on this album as far as like his guitar tone on that solo.
I'm looking at my notes, and yes, I know this record like pretty much inside and out because it's Pantera and I'm a nerd. But for some reason, I have no notes for Tens. It went right to 13 Steps to Nowhere. So let's just go with your view of Tens.
Okay.
Well, my apologies on that one. Oh. I did not realize that till just now.
All good. Well, then, 13 Steps to Nowhere.
I mean, that one's just, that is such an iconic song for this record. The drums and the vibe. I remember back when I was playing Zen Hipster and, you know, we had practice and, you know, Eric Reese he didn't really like super heavy stuff. And that's fine.
Yeah.
But when this record came out, I came over and he was just blaring that song. And so that always stood out to me because if that stood out to him, that was definitely something different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that riff from Dimebag on this song specifically is like a classic groove style
Exactly.
riff. And
And the drums are just insane. Like you can't even get into that. So I mean, if you know what I mean.
yeah, that was actually one of the notes I wrote down was the drums were extremely memorable.
That's all I have is drums in capital letters with like 4 exclamation points.
Might be the only. Is this the only Pantera song that actually just opens with drums only?
Oh, I don't know.
Off the top of my head, at least. But then we get into kind of the more, I would say, well-known tracks of this album, or at least when you hear people talk about this album, people always bring up Suicide Note Part One and Part Two. I'm
Yeah.
lumping them together, even though they're stylistically opposites. I've always felt like, as far as songs that were written to go together, compare it to We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions or
Yeah.
Journey, feeling that way anytime, like songs that were like meant to be together, like this is as good as it gets.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. And I even liked Zach Wild's cover.
Oh yeah, yeah, same. Like I always thought that, at least back then, before Zach Wild ever covered, I always thought it'd be cool if like Pepper Keenan or just some kind of like outlaw country
Right.
style artist would sit down and acoustically cover Part One,
Hmm.
because that song always had this kind of like that gave me a vibe of like the early '90s grunge stuff when it like Mark Lanigan or Lane Staley or Chris Cornell, when it was more that visceral kind of just like
Right.
whatever the right adjectives are, you know what I mean, but has this beauty to it, but it's also like extremely dark at the same time. And it's like it was very
Absolutely.
unique unto itself as far as a Pantera song goes, especially at that time. Prior
Yeah.
to that, like Planet Caravan might have been the only thing in that style where it never got heavy.
Okay. Yeah.
But then, of course, Suicide Note Part 2, if you consider it one full song, obviously it gets extremely heavy.
Oh yeah. It just like
Yeah.
it's like a blast off, dude.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of, Dimebag's coolest riffs of all time is that riff throughout I guess you would call it the chorus of that song, where like the groove riff and Suicide Note Part 2. I mean,
They knew they were so synced up at the same time to just be completely extreme and completely heavy, and it was really a treat.
it almost feels like even like once that song gets to the solo, like after that, it somehow picks up more energy. Maybe that's just me. I don't know, but like it just seems, and it has
Right?
that slow kind of doomy, slight kind of ending, but
Oh yeah.
it's almost like Suicide Note Part 3 at that point,
Yeah.
Living Through Me, Hell's Wrath. This is, definitely one of my favorite songs on this album. But it's very, as far as the rest of the album, it's pretty straightforward outside of that middle part. I mean, it's got that very old school Pantera style riffing, but with Phil's kind of growing extreme metal energy.
Yeah, I mean, I really, it's got those fucked up lyrics,
Yeah,
but it's like you said, it's classic Pantera though.
yeah.
So I mean, I'm down.
And then Floods, you got, I never realized how popular the song was. I saw it on, like the other day when I was doing the notes for this. I saw like how many listens it had, and it was up there with like, the kind of the trademark songs. I felt that the beginning and the vocal vibe of it almost reminded me of Return to Serenity by Testament, even though it doesn't
Right,
sound like Testament. It's that same style with guitar and vocal. But the
which is
coolest
a
part by
great.
far is the middle and the solo. But
Oh yeah, which is a great song, by the way. Don't need to get off track, but I've been listening to a lot of Testament lately.
okay.
I love Return to Serenity, and I love the Ritual album.
Yes.
Anyways,
Such a great album.
oh, absolutely, and I'm sure it's a lot of people's least favorite album, and I don't care.
Right.
So, but Floods it's so good, and what I think is so cool about Floods is that melody, that guitar breakdown, and I think it's on one of those Dime Vision DVDs that I used to have. God knows what happened to it. I'm sure you could find it on YouTube now,
Yeah.
but way back in the '80s, before they had Phil, there's a video of them in Lawton, Oklahoma, and
Know
he
about
did
that.
Floods. He did that guitar line in his guitar solo. So
Wow.
he had that for so long, and he was always working on it. So it was so cool to hear that finally put down to tape.
Yeah. It would have been cool to get more, of that kind of tone from him, like just in any other song, just because it was just kind of so unique unto that song, at
Right,
least as far as like
right.
the studio albums we got from Pantera and from Dimebag.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Next track was The Underground in America, and this is one of those songs that always just I kind of forget about until
Yeah.
you throw this album on. But it's still a cool song. I mean, I don't think there's any filler on this at all. And the coolest part
No,
is kind of when
it
it
is.
speeds up in the middle, I think, and that solo is kind of unique and weird. Like, what are your thoughts on the solo of that?
Actually, dude, I have no notes on the solo.
Okay.
Dude, I'm not gonna bullshit you. Like my notes are just like fill everywhere on this one.
Right.
So that's just kind of where I sit on that one.
Gotcha. Yeah, the next track or the final track was the reprise Sandblasted Skin, which is a reprise of the opening title track where you kind of get a play on that riff again. You get a little bit of the same lyrics again, but then it kind of goes off into its own thing there for a bit. You get more of that slower paced groove than, Trendkill, obviously. But
Right.
the drumming on this song really stands out to me as well, kind of like we talked about with 13 Steps compared to most of the other songs. I feel like Vinny wasn't as on display as he was on the last two albums.
Who doesn't love a reprise?
Right. Especially if it's
So
good.
yeah, they capped it off like they know how to do.
That song actually had a hidden track, but it was, basically just this song coming back for another 30 seconds.
That
Which
was
I
what
was,
they did in the '90s. Your CDs had hidden
yeah.
tracks.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I wrote that down as a note, I guess, that hidden tracks, that's kind of funny because it's something that there's like a whole generation of people that's not even a thing that they know about, or would know about.
No, it's like, huh?
Yeah.
Excuse me?
And some of, bands would do it like completely stupid ones too, where there'd be like 8 minutes and then it would be like
Right.
a click of a button or a static or some stupid shit.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, the Great Southern Trendkill, I mean, I don't know. Pantera is always one of those bands where it's hard for me to rank albums like Faith No More or something, but it's, I've always kind of put those, at least the five, major label albums, I've always put them kind of almost in the order they came out, outside of flipping, Vulgar and Cowboys maybe, but
right.
I still, the difference between them all is pretty minute to me, but I still kind of think that the three albums before it just kind of hold more weight with me, but I absolutely love this album.
Right. So let me ask you, what do you like better, this album or Reinventing the Steel?
This album. I mean, it for the longest time, it was a definite answer of this album. And then there was a period of time where I started listening to Reinventing a lot more, and it kind of got heavier into it than I was when it came out. Because when it came out, I liked it, but it was my least favorite Pantera album. But
right.
now that, we're 30, well, whatever we are, 26 years away from that, I hold it in much higher regard than I used to, but I still probably put Trendkill above that. How do you feel? That. Or where do you place it?
I love this record. I love it for the grit factor and that the time that maybe it's not the best record ever, but for the time it came out, I thought this was a big middle finger, so I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I really enjoy that. But if you're going to ask me like song wise, I think I like Reinventing the Steel better.
Okay.
Just a middle finger to everything. I really liked where this album sat with its attitude and the time period.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway is that it was like just perfect for that moment in time, because even
absolutely,
like you said, all that alternative stuff, people out there going to see Dishwalla, and then Pantera's out there touring with Neurosis opening for him. So it's
exactly. And we fucking saw that shit. It was fucking weird, and it was like Neurosis played the goddamn the video of Bud Dwyer killing himself over and over on their background.
That's right.
I mean, Pantera had some like crazy shit with going on with them back then, and I'm not condoning all that, but I'm just saying, in a time in the mid '90s where everything was so gentle, they were caustic and they didn't give a shit, and I kind of appreciate that.
Yeah, I think it helped them too. I mean, helped maintain to be the legendary band they were already becoming at that point. Because
definitely, I agree.
I mean, they never kind of went. I mean, most extreme bands don't, but they never went that way where they kind of shifted. Like Sepultura put out Roots. It was an album that was cool, but awesome, but it very much fit into the time period,
right?
In the metal world, and same with like Megadeth with Risk, or some of these bands that are putting out albums that are,
Mhm.
slightly different or trying to fit
Yeah,
into a commercial thing. Pantera is just like kind of the
and
opposite.
yeah, and Pantera was like, "Oh, so you want us to go a little softer? No, how about we go a little bit more fucked up?"
Right?
And they did that,
Yeah.
and I applaud that.
The next episode of this podcast, is going to be about another album by Def Leppard that basically did the exact opposite of what we just said.
Yeah, like how do we make this transition, Trent? What the fuck?
Well, the world doesn't need to know we're recording them at the same time, so
No, not at all. Yeah,
Yeah,
and we can do whatever we want.
that's right. So, with that being said, unless do you have anything else you want to throw in about Trendkill, or you think you?
Yeah, there's one more thing, like, as opposed to all the, how kind of just abrasive it was. I really, really enjoyed the snake theme of the artwork.
Oh yeah,
I really, really enjoyed that. And, the cover has the snake, but a lot of their themes and their t shirts and their merch and, whatever the hell, I don't care. It was all like the snake and the skeleton of the snake. And I just think that really fit in and sent a message with the whole Trendkill vibe of that time.
oh yeah.
And so I really enjoyed that. I don't know how much that really even matters to a lot of people, but I really dug that.
No, I mean, thinking about it, I think it's cool how that album cover has this real stark, red and gold vibe to it, whereas
Right.
Far Beyond Driven had like a very stark blue vibe to it, and then Bulgar was black and
Yeah.
white. They all kind of. It seemed like, I guess. Well, no, because then Reinventing the Steel was just that that weird cover. But
Yeah.
anyway, I mean, this is classic album. 30 years later, we're old as fuck. I guess is what that means.
It does. But you're right though. This was a great album to burn down
Yeah,
because of course, Cowboys from Hell and Vulgar and Far Beyond were monumental records. This record doesn't get enough love, and it doesn't get enough recognition for what it did at the time.
yeah,
So I really enjoyed kind of talking about this record because it needs a little bit more recognition, I think.
yeah, yeah. Same, because I enjoyed just like listening back, because I think the last time I listened to it straight through might have been when we did the every album in a row thing years ago. If I'm
Right.
if
Well,
I'm being
and
honest,
now that we're talking about it, and one last thing is this is a record that got me. If you think about it, this is why before the Pantera celebration came back together. Anytime Phil Anselmo did anything with his extreme projects, you and I got to benefit a lot from that in our podcast days. We got to go to a lot of those shows. We got to interview some of those guys. We got to see a lot of those shows very up close. And they were very caustic, very violent, very abrasive. And I appreciate where Phil went with that because a lot of those dudes, they go softer as they get older.
yeah,
And he didn't. He got more fucked up and more violent with that music. And I appreciated that. And I really dug some of that. I dug what he did with Superjoint, and I really liked what he did with the Illegals. And I think that this was kind of a springboard for that.
yeah. It's like the first album where you get those sounds from him. Yeah,
because I'm being honest with you, I don't like Hell Yeah. I just don't. It just doesn't do anything for me. It's just weak to me. Yeah. Doesn't mean it's not good, but in my ears, I just don't get it, and I don't like it. You hear this record, and then you hear where he went, and I just appreciate Phil's vibe with all of that stuff, and I think this was kind of a springboard for that. So that's kind of another vibe I wanted to touch on.
Yeah, I agree 100% on that for sure.
I mean, literally, dude, when we went to Oklahoma City to that tiny venue, 89th Street, and we saw Phil, I mean, how cool was that? That was amazing. That was almost as amazing as seeing Pantera.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get that vibe from Hell Yeah. Sorry, but
Right.
you're just not.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean that was especially cool because that was the time period, like you said, before Pantera got back together. It was the first time he was playing Pantera songs again outside of, he might do one song a show prior to that, and this time he did like a full half the set.
It was exactly what it needed to be, and it was. He knew, like, I could do other stuff and headline bigger places, but he didn't care. Like, this is what I want to do. But we were so lucky to see Phil Anselmo at like that place in Arkansas, and then 89th Street, just like these little hold the walls,
Oh yeah.
do all those Pantera songs before he went and got huge again with the whole Pantera thing. And it's just another reason to admire that even more.
Well, there you go. A little bit of a rundown on 30-year anniversary of the Great Southern Trendkill from Pantera. Huge thank you there to Jason for coming back on and talk to me about his thoughts on this album from Pantera 30 years later. Always glad to have Jason back. He started this podcast with me 11 years ago. The 11th anniversary is about a week and a half away, I believe. You look at the actual date, but it's mid-May. Maybe we'll see something on that coming very shortly. But, going back through the history of this, like I mentioned up front, there's been tons of bands throughout the history that I think Pantera fans would like that have been on this podcast, and there's been tons of, bands that are related to Pantera through touring or through, side projects and all that kind of thing that have been on this podcast. But like Jason mentioned there at the end of the talk, one of the cool things was when Jason was with me doing this podcast, we did a lot more on-site, in-person interviews at concerts, basically. Like when a band was on tour, we'd either do it, whether it be here in our home area of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but we also hit up Oklahoma City a lot, Fort Smith, Joplin, Wichita, on occasion, even Dallas to do podcasts. But one of those times we saw, it was Superjoint along with Battlecross and Childbite. And it's one of the few times, if not, I think it may be actually still be the only time that it was like a full bill and we did an interview with a member of every band on the bill. So we did 3 interviews prior to that show. A lot of times like that, it's not easy to work around schedules whenever someone's on tour. You've got to kind of do it when they're available. And to get 3 bands like that at once was great. So, but the point of this is on that Superjoint, the member we talked to was Jimmy Bower. And besides Superjoint, Jimmy Bower, of course, is an original member of I Hate God. And on top of that, he's been a member of Down as well. When we were interviewing him, on the Superjoint bus. And during the interview, Phil walks out of the back. I believe it was to make himself to pour himself a cup of coffee. There was a guy standing outside the bus that you could see outside the window. And Phil made a comment about how the dude looked like Pepper Keenan. And he did. And that was basically the end of it. He said, "What's up?" Said that about that dude, said something else, and then kind of went on his way. So there was our relation to have a member of Pantera on the podcast. But like I said, Jimmy Bower of Down, Superjoint, I Hate God has been on here. Other members of Down, Kirk Winstein, he's been on here a couple times. Other members of Superjoint, Steven Taylor, guitarist, he's been on here before as well. He is also a member, he was, I assume it's not really, hasn't been active in a while, but Philip H. Anselmo and the Illegals, Phil's solo band that Jason alluded to. There at the end that we saw a couple Superjoint shows around that time, but also a couple illegal shows, and one of those was at 89th Street in Oklahoma City. If you're not familiar with that club, it's extremely defines the phrase hole in the wall. And it's just a great place to see, heavy music. It's got that old school underground club attitude. And to see Phil and the Illegals perform a set of Pantera songs, because at that time that hadn't really happened. I had seen him live with the Illegals a few years prior in the teens when he played in Tulsa, and I believe he actually played Walk at that show, which he didn't do that often, and he played Walk because there was a kid in the crowd, it was, that had asked, I think like his dad or maybe him, or had sent Phil a message on social media and explained the situation. But it was a kid that, was a guitarist battling cancer, was a big fan of Pantera. Phil played Walk at that Tulsa show at the Cain's Ballroom and brought that kid up there to play the guitar parts, so he kind of got his, Make-A-Wish style situation there for that kid who, because it became a national news thing around that time as well. And the kid unfortunately passed away. I think it wasn't that long after that, or it was within a few months mainly, but, a random thing to point out, but I thought that was great. But back to, people that have been on the podcast, former members of White Zombie, all those metal bands that were big in the 90s, around the same time as Pantera, that toured with Pantera, like White Zombie and Typo Negative, both have had a couple members on this podcast. And in fact, when it comes to Typo Negative, the very most recent episode of this podcast, episode 457, features Johnny Kelly, the drummer of Typo Negative. He is part of the band Sun Don't Shine, which just released their debut album a little over a month ago. And that band, besides featuring Johnny, also features Kenny Hickey from Typo Negative, and it features Kirk Winstein and Todd Strange from Crowbar and Down. So it's all tying back together. It's all Pantera related somehow, right? But also besides, Typo Negative, another one of my favorite bands, I've had on members of Prong, Helmet, Seven Dust, Corrosion Conformity, Clutch, Megadeth, Testament, Anthrax, Armored Saint. John Bush was on here earlier this year. Actually, it was the end of last year, December, before he did those Anthrax, his era of Anthrax solo shows that he did. Very cool. I've also had members of Kiss. Gene Simmons been on here. Twisted Sister, Queensryche, Def Leppard, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, Whitesnake, LA Guns, modern rock stuff like Skillet, Breaking Benjamin, Hellstorm, Shinedown, Three Doors Down, Saliva, Killswitch Engage has been on here. Couple different members. Couple members of Living Colour, Leonard Skinnard. The list is giant and the list is long. Vanilla Ice has been on here, so go check that out if you feel so inclined. 11 years worth of episodes, and the very next episode will be similar to this one, as we kind of alluded to there once or twice, I believe, in that talk. The next episode will be a 30-year anniversary as well, because the following week after Pantera's The Great Southern Trendkill came out, Def Leppard's album Slang came out. Totally opposite ends of the rock spectrum. But that's one of the things I've always loved about this podcast is we don't define it into genres or boxes. It's just all rock music, even though we focus on the harder side. But it could be hard rock, it could be glam hair bands, it could be classic rock, it could be grunge, it could be extreme metal, it could be death metal, Norwegian black metal, it could be melodic death metal. Speaking of, Michael Stahn from Dark Tranquillity and the original vocalist of In Flames was on here once. So was members of Avatar. And I didn't even mention members of Halloween as well. So many great band names I could throw out there, but again, TheThunderUnderground.com, you can listen to everything there. Wherever you're listening now, hit like, follow, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Wherever you're listening as well, if you could leave a comment or a review, that's a massive help. Anytime you see a social media post, if you just like, comment, or share, that's also a massive help. It's an easy way to help this podcast because it gets more people's eyes on it. Follow on all those socials if you don't already. YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, X, Blue Sky, Threads. All the socials. Daily content that comes out. Daily reels and shorts and all that great stuff that are separate from these episodes of this podcast. So give a like and follow on all those things so you don't miss, like I said, those future episodes. Dig back through 457 episodes previous to this one. And yeah, I'm going to get out of here. Once again, a massive thank you to DEB Concerts, Rocklahoma Bitches, Sunset Tattoo, and my friend Jason Wood. And until next time.
Thunder Underground, y'all.